sure because of the bad weather, this is the largest audience we're going to get tonight, but we welcome you with open arms. I would like to remind you to turn your cell phones down or off. I would like to call attention to Silas Hasselbrook, and I'm going to embarrass him, and there'll be a break running from embarrassment glowing over there. He's been accepted to Concordia University in Wisconsin. He's an accomplished pianist and organist and has applied for a scholarship to help pay for his tuition. The requirement was 2 piano arrangements and 2 organ arrangements. He plays the organ for a church that his dad's a minister at in the Rattlesnake. He currently is going to Loyola High School. Silas welcomed our group this evening with one of his arrangements called Andante Sostenuto by Schubert. Let us give Silas a round of applause. And if you'll please consider dropping a stipend in that patriotic hat back there to help Silas for college. I would appreciate it because he really does a lot of work for us, and he has taken the load off my shoulders with setting up and taking down and providing us music, which adds to the atmosphere. We'll have now the invocation by Trish Orris.
This is a little, start off with a little story. A shoe salesman was sent to a remote part of the country. When he arrived, he was dismayed because everyone went around barefooted. So he wired the company. No prospect for sales. People don't wear shoes here. Later, another salesman went to the same territory. He too sent word to the home office, but his telegram read, "Great potential. People don't wear shoes here." When Joshua and Caleb returned from Canaan, they described a land flowing with milk and honey and opportunity. The other 10 spies also saw a land flowing with milk and honey, but they also saw obstacles standing in the way of conquering the land. How could 2 opinions based on the same facts be so different? The answer is simple. The majority view didn't take God into account, and that spelled insurmountable obstacles. The minority report, however, included God, and that spelled unlimited opportunity. Our leaders who take God into account are being opposed and harassed by those who don't. We pray for those who take a stand that no weapon formed against them will prosper. We also pray for protection for their families. We also pray that they will succeed in representing godliness in our nation. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you, Trish. Bob, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? And I'd like to thank Bob and Trish. They are always here, and they bring water to every one of our meetings. Okay.
Would you face the flag, please, with me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Want to play the national anthem? We could remain standing, please. just announce what you're running for.
House District 97.
Okay, Brad Cheatham. And Lynn Helgard?
House District 96.
Great, we appreciate that. One more thing, we are going to have our next meeting on March 19th here at 7 o'clock. The meeting is going to be on Common Core with Marion Anderson of Livingston coming. And if anybody wants any tickets, I have a couple more tickets left for the Dr. Ben Carson event on March 13th in Kalispell. See me afterwards. Now I'm just going to make a brief introduction of our speaker, who's been waiting very patiently. He's currently the Montana Director for Americans for Prosperity. He's a lifelong Montana resident, serving in the legislature for 12 years in both the House and the Senate. He's been on the Senate Business, Labor, and Economics Affairs Legislative Audit Committee, crafted bills to reduce and simplify taxes, reform education, reform government, and anything he worked on was so that we would have a better life as Montanans. Joe is a national award-winning CPA, and he is a small business owner and has been for 34 years. He has 3 children, married, and has 3 children. He's written 2 books and numerous articles advocating limits on the intrusiveness of government. He also has a bachelor's degree from the UN. Without any further ado, here's Joe Bellia. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Gloria.
That's right.
So, Obamacare is formally called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and some have said that the problem with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is that it neither protects patients nor is it affordable. Other than that, it's perfectly fine. Except that the name is too long also, so during the last presidential debates, even President Obama said that he liked calling it Obamacare. So with that in mind, we'll stick to that for short, Obamacare, and I don't say it disparagingly, I just say it to save time. I want to start out by just talking about what I call the 8 legs of Obamacare. I kind of use the analogy of an octopus. The 8 legs began with the new coverage mandates that now are required within every insurance policy. And those mandates are 3 different types. One of them says that you cannot deny somebody based on pre-existing conditions. The second is something called community rating, that with only a very few limited exceptions, you can't charge a healthy person less than what you charge an unhealthy person. And the third mandate is included medical coverage, that all insurance policies must cover all conditions. In other words, a 65-year-old male must pay for pregnancy coverage, and the nuns at the Sisters of Charity must pay for abortion coverage in their policies. So you can't pick and choose what you have covered in your insurance. Between those 3 mandates, I call those the cost redistribution mandates or the cost socialization mandates, and their intent is to take the costs of people who have high medical costs and spread them out over people who don't have as high medical costs. So that's the first leg of the octopus, is the new coverage mandates that are now required in every insurance policy. The second leg of the octopus is the government subsidies. The government will now, and I say the government, but it's actually the taxpayers, of course, that are paying for it. The taxpayers will now subsidize the cost of insurance for some people, lower income people, because the cost of this new insurance, once you put those 3 new mandates into it, the cost of this insurance is going to be driven so much higher that it will have to be subsidized for a lot of people to afford it. And I'll go into more detail in each of these legs as the presentation goes on. The third leg of the octopus is that there will now be various new taxes imposed to pay for all these subsidies and to pay for the cost of the bureaucracy to implement Obamacare with all its intricate rules. And there are roughly 20 different new taxes. The fourth leg is what's called the individual mandate, that everybody will be forced to buy this new insurance. And the reason they have to have this individual mandate, of course, is because once the cost goes up so much higher, a lot of people will realize it's not a good deal, and so that's why they have to force people to buy it. The third leg of the octopus is, the fifth leg of the octopus, and I apologize, folks, I got a new pair of glasses on. I injured my eye in a freak fishing accident, and it keeps changing, so I've got some new glasses on. If I have an awkward Marco Rubio moment, that's because I've lost my cursor on the screen. The fifth leg of the octopus is the employer mandate that will force larger businesses to pay for insurance for all their employees, or at least all their full-time employees, because again, you got to force them to do it if it's not a good deal. The sixth leg of the octopus is insurance price controls, that insurance companies will now be limited as to how much they can charge based on the increase in their costs. Unfortunately, that doesn't do much for the consumer because costs are going to be rising so rapidly, and I'll show you some charts to back that up. Costs will be rising so rapidly that this doesn't really protect consumers that much. The seventh leg is insurance exchanges, and these are exchanges set up either by the federal government or by the states. And those insurance exchanges give what I argue is the illusion of consumer choice, when actually it's just the opposite. There really isn't any real consumer choice under Obamacare, because every insurance policy must have all these coverages in them. The only differences are, if you get a bronze plan, for instance, you'll be paying more out of your own pocket to start with, whereas with a gold or platinum plan, you'll be paying less out of your own pocket for your co-insurance, but you'll be paying a higher cost monthly for the cost of the insurance. So ultimately, there's no choice difference, and in fact, the insurance exchanges are used as a mechanism of control. You must buy your insurance through either a state exchange or the federal exchange in order to get the taxpayer subsidies to pay for part of the cost of your insurance. The eighth leg of the octopus is Medicaid expansion, and that's to give totally free, although nothing's really free, again, the taxpayers pay for it, to give totally free but substandard insurance to lower income people. And again, I will go through all 8 of these legs and kind of give you an analysis of how they work, and I'll even talk about the exemptions to the mandate penalty. You could possibly argue that there's a 9th leg, but of course if I did that, I would ruin my octopus analogy. And so I didn't give it a 9th leg, but if you did find an octopus with a 9th leg, that 9th leg would be the fact that there will be government restrictions on the type of treatments you can get. Whether you want to use the hyperbole of the so-called death panels that some people talk about, or whether you simply want to state that he who pays the piper calls the tune, the fact remains, if you rely on the government to pay for your medical treatments, the government will decide what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. That's simply how the world works. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Okay, so let me kind of begin and try to take a logical progression here. I liken also Obamacare to kind of like a series of dominoes, but each domino is bigger than the one before it, so the ultimate domino that falls has an enormous impact on our healthcare delivery system and our economy as well. Obamacare began with a pretty simple notion, and that was the notion that, people with pre-existing conditions ought to be able to still get insurance. And it sounds like a great idea, okay? I think a lot of probably people of us here in this room kind of think, well, yeah, it seems right that people ought to somehow be able to get insurance. But I argue that beginning with that simple concept, the dominoes fall, and that in effect, the left has ruined health insurance. And here's how they did it. They did it by changing the definition of insurance. The old definition, and I've got it up on the screen, the old definition is that you would pay a present fixed cost, a small cost, to protect yourself against an unforeseen future catastrophe. And it was based on an actual actuarial calculation, an equation, where the potential cost of the future catastrophe times the odds of that catastrophe occurring equaled the current value of protecting yourself against that future risk, and that was the cost of the insurance. It was a square deal. It wasn't a good deal or a bad deal. It was a square deal. And let me give you an example. If you have a $1 million potential exposure in your future, and you want to protect yourself against that, and the odds of it occurring are estimated at 1%. You would take 1% times $1 million, and that would be the cost of the insurance, $10,000. Again, simple math. It's not a good deal or a bad deal, it's a square deal. The new definition of insurance that has occurred over the last 2 decades and culminated with Obamacare is that insurance is a means of socializing some people's known, and that's the key word, known high medical costs onto everybody else's back in society. And so it's a cost redistribution mechanism. And again, they did this through putting 3 new mandates into every insurance policy that qualifies under Obamacare. The first is to cover pre-existing conditions, that you can't refuse somebody even if they already have a known medical condition. The second is community rating, that with only very few limited exceptions, you can't charge more based on someone who has good health versus someone who is already sick. You can't charge more based on someone who has a healthy lifestyle based on someone who has an unhealthy lifestyle. And the third is that you have forced coverages instead of choices. You can't buy policies that only cover limited things. Every policy has to cover everything. Again, perfect example, the 65-year-old man with pregnancy coverage. Now, I can tell you that those 3 cost redistribution mandates will drive, and I've already driven, the cost of insurance enormously higher. And I can tell you that as former chairman of the Senate Business and Economic Affairs Committee. That was the committee where every time there was someone wanted to put a new mandate into insurance policies in Montana, that bill would come before my committee. And we would have a fiscal note attached to every one of those mandates. And some of them were great things. You know, you'd have parents with autistic children, and they'd come before your committee and they'd say, we want insurance to have to cover autism. They didn't want to be able to go out there and buy a policy that you could have a choice whether it covered autism or not. They wanted to force it into every policy in Montana, again, to redistribute the costs of their, and I'm sympathetic, okay? But the problem with that is that it's very expensive, and the fiscal notes would always show just the cost to government. They wouldn't even show the cost to the private sector. And even the cost just to government would be enormously high, and the cost to the private sector and individuals in the private sector would be astronomical and would dwarf the cost to government. And the reason for that is simple math. I mean, follow the math. If someone has a $1 million medical condition, and it's already a known condition, it's a pre-existing condition, $1 million times 100% probability that it will occur is $1 million, okay? And so it greatly increases the cost of insurance, these 3 mandates, when they force them into every insurance policy. And this, by the way, is what President Obama means when he says, quote, it's a better policy, because it has to cover all 3 of those mandates that I just mentioned. But those 3 mandates, I liken them to the 3 prongs of a pitchfork that are prodding the cost of insurance, health insurance, ever higher. Now, once you add in these additional costs and the enormous cost of the bureaucracy to run it, and I'll go through that and explain it here shortly as well, it's no longer a smart financial move for a person to pay for this new expensive health insurance. It's no longer a square deal, it's a bad deal. And so the only way to make it happen is to force people to do it. WOLA, that's why Obamacare is the next logical step, is mandates and penalties, that people are mandated to buy it, and there are penalties if you don't. And the socialization of cost is what makes this health insurance mandate far more destructive and costly to our economy and to ourselves as individuals than a car insurance mandate. At least the car insurance that you're forced to buy is based on your own car, your own driving record, and your own miles driven. Okay? I want you to note just a couple things on the screen. I said the community rating mandate has a few limited exceptions. Those 4 items listed there are not samples of the exceptions. Those are the exceptions. Those are the only 4 things that they can charge more for. They can charge more based on your family size. They can charge 50% more if you're a smoker with cancer. They can charge you 50% more than someone who's never smoked in their life and is in good health. They can charge an elderly person 3 times more than a young person, but those don't really reflect the costs of providing care to those groups. For instance, I had an independent insurance agent at my last presentation, and he pointed out that out in the market prior to Obamacare, an elderly person would typically be charged 6 or 7 times more than a young person, just because that's how much more their health care costs are. That's why Obamacare forces a lot of the costs onto the backs of the young as well as onto the backs of the healthy, but the young in particular, and I'll show you some statistics on that later. That's why tomorrow night I'm doing the presentation up at University of Montana, and I've been doing it at colleges all over the state because young people are vitally interested in what now they're being asked to shoulder. Okay, so let's go to the next logical step. This statement that President Obama made, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it, was labeled as the lie of the year by PolitiFax. And PolitiFax, by the way, is, if anything, a left-leaning organization. They're not, by any stretch, a right-wing organization, and yet they labeled it the lie of the year. They didn't label it the lie of the year because it wasn't true. They labeled it the lie of the year because there's no way it could be true. If the administration had allowed these prior plans to coexist alongside Obamacare, with the prior plans being exempt from his 3 cost socialization mandates, nobody would switch over to Obamacare because there would be a huge cost differential. Their old plans would be way cheaper. On the other hand, if he took those previously existing insurance plans and forced them to take on these 3 new cost drivers, there's no way the insurance companies could maintain anything close to their previous rates. So the only real alternative was to set up a mechanism that basically forced these old insurance plans out of the market. Cancel them. So this is what happens. I was on my way to Great Falls to give my first surviving Obamacare presentation, and I was carrying 2 pieces of mail to my son and my daughter-in-law. And I was talking to the editor of the Great Falls Tribune, and he says, well, we'll send a reporter, but we sure hope there's some real-life examples of people who've been harmed by Obamacare, and it's not just a bunch of people speculating about how it's going to hurt them. And I said, well, I don't know who'll be there, but we'll see. On my way there, I gave the 2 letters to my son and daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law opened her mail, and lo and behold, this is what she found: a cancellation notice from Blue Cross Blue Shield saying that her policy had been canceled. And that's where we're headed. And again, just so you understand, you all know that President Obama has taken tremendous criticism because he didn't keep his promise. Well, there's a reason that despite all that criticism, he hasn't reneged on that. He cannot keep his promise, or it would simply undermine the financial viability of Obamacare at its very root. It would never even achieve launch. Okay, so these old policies are basically being canceled, and people are moved into a new system with new costs attached. This is the cumulative result of Obamacare's 3 new insurance cost drivers and the higher premiums. And by the way, these statistics are are actually much higher than that. This is for Montana, and this was done by the Manhattan Institute, but the Manhattan Institute has come out with some new figures that are substantially higher. These figures show a roughly 20% increase in cost out of the gate and a 36.25% increase for the elderly. But the truth of the matter is, and again, there are new statistics that show much higher increases, but even at the much higher increases, Montana is really an outlier. Most of the rest of the nation will actually be hit far worse by these new insurance mandates. And this is the figures for the rest of the nation on average. For young males, age 27, a 77% increase in the cost of insurance. For older males, roughly a 50% increase. And for females, a 40% increase. And that's only the beginning, and I'll get to that in a minute. Because of the fact that it basically shifts the cost to the young population, it's having an enormous negative effect on young people and on universities. And the university systems around the state of Montana are struggling with how they're going to pay for this new higher cost. You've seen some headlines in your newspapers. This one was from the Bozeman Chronicle, but they've been around the state talking about the fact that the university systems units are going to have to come up with a new strategy for dealing with this higher cost. They're either going to have to pass it on to the students or somehow deal with it. So there have been attempts to try to chart how the Obamacare plan works together, how the bureaucracy will be able to implement it. The problem is that once you cross the line where you say we're going to mandate all these new mandates in insurance, and then you also say we're then going to give a government subsidy to people based on how high their income is to cover this, it requires an enormous bureaucracy to implement that whole process. I call it the micromeddling in people's healthcare decisions and in their finances to dissect how big a subsidy each is going to be entitled to. The cost of the law, to implement the law, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan arbiter, this law will cost $1.78 trillion between now and the next 9 years through 2023. 1.1 trillion of that is the cost for the premium tax credits, the subsidies that will go out to each person under the law. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the average credit needed to try to make this insurance, to push it back down where it's going to be affordable, and even that affordable, I'll tell you how they define it. It's not really affordable even with the subsidy, but the cost of those subsidies on average is estimated this year to be $5,290 per person in the system. And again, the taxpayers will be paying for that, and our children and our children's children will be paying for that cost, and that cost is going to rise as the insurance rates go up. And again, this $1.798 trillion is only the cost to government, to the federal government. It does not include the cost to the private sector. The cost to the private sector will dwarf that, and it does not include the cost to state governments as well. So that's a chart, and after people have tried to dissect that chart and follow through with how Obamacare is going to work, some people have embellished the chart a little bit. And if you look very closely there, you're going to see President Obama in a Where's Waldo outfit. In truth, and the reason I show this chart is to try to keep some of you awake, but also, in truth, this chart isn't really too much of an embellishment, because the previous chart that I showed you does not include, it only includes one charting of the state bureaucracy necessary to implement Obamacare, and in truth, that bureaucracy is going to be duplicated 50 times over at each state level. And so once you include all the state bureaucracies, this chart really isn't that much of an embellishment. So now that you understand the costs involved to both support the bureaucracy and to pay for this higher cost insurance, the question arises, how will we and our children pay for all this? There are 21 separate tax increases or new taxes in the Obamacare bill, and it's a 2,900-page bill, as many of you know. 75% of these taxes hit the middle class significantly, and in fact, you may recall from the 2008 presidential election cycle that the promise was made, quote, "I won't raise taxes on the middle class." Despite that promise, $500 billion in total tax hikes, again, 75% of which hit the middle class. And I'm just going to quickly rattle off some of the more significant tax hikes, and then we're going to take a little bit more time talking about the important ones. The first is the individual mandate tax, and once it's fully implemented, it's phased in starting this year, 2014 through 2016. When it's fully phased in, it will be 2.5% times your gross income if you do not have Obamacare qualified health insurance. The second is the employer mandate tax, and it's either $3,000 per employee or $2,000 per employee. I'll explain that more in a later slide. A third is the investment income surtax, and this is a 3.8% tax, 3.8% times your interest income, your dividend income, your rental income, capital gains if you sold a piece of land or if you sell stocks. This is a new almost a 4% tax, royalties as well, on top of what you currently pay for state and federal income taxes. There's a 0.9% Medicare payroll tax hike. So if you're a wage earner, if you're paying Medicare, this is roughly a 1% increase in your taxes that will be taken out as additional Medicare. There's something called a special needs kids tax. There's a medical device sales tax. There's a tax increase that will be on many of your tax returns when you do them this year. I'm still a practicing tax accountant, and I've already done some tax returns. When you go to calculate your itemized deductions, you add up your medical expenses, and now under Obamacare, you have to subtract off 10% of your adjusted gross income first. That's a new higher figure. So for instance, if you make $50,000, the first $5,000 of your medical expenses will not save you any money whatsoever, even if you itemize deductions, because that has to be subtracted off under the new rules with Obamacare. And there's also a reduced deduction for your health savings account. If some of you use health savings accounts to try to meet some of your insurance needs and get a tax deduction, that tax deduction will be reduced this year to a lower figure. There's something called a Blue Cross Blue Shield tax hike. There's a tax on high-end health insurance plans. There's a tax on innovator drug companies, which many economists speculate and fear that it might put a damper on medical research. There's something called an insurance premiums tax, which I'll talk about in a second. There's the elimination of a tax deduction for employer-provided retiree prescription drugs, etc. The insurance premiums tax that I mentioned is the biggest tax that's kicking in this year, and this is an annual fee on health insurers that many speculate is basically going to be passed on and result in higher insurance rates. And it's meant to pay for the subsidies that they're going to give to some taxpayers who sign up for Obamacare insurance. This fee is projected to bring in $8 billion this year and roughly $100 billion over the next decade. The insurance industry, and in fact more than 200 members of Congress, including some Democrats and some Republicans, are trying to repeal this tax because they believe and they warn that it's simply going to be passed on to the consumer. A recent study estimated that one tax alone will cause insurance rates to go up in 2014 by 2.3%, and that by 2023 that one tax will be causing insurance rates to go up by almost 4% per year, 3.7%. There are a number of other taxes that in effect will end up being passed on into insurance rates. There's a temporary fee to raise $25 billion to try to cover some of the people with pre-existing conditions. There's a fee of $63 per person, whoever signs up for the new insurance plan. And one of the more interesting ones is there's some insurance companies will be hit with a fee to fund what is known as the quote risk adjustment program. And this particular program is meant to spread the risk even more. Again, I told you that the 3 new mandates in Obamacare insurance are what I call cost redistribution or cost socialization mandates. But even if you have those 3 mandates in every insurance policy, there is still the potential out there that a bunch of healthy people could migrate to one insurance company, and as a result, that insurance company could end up with, you know, the ability to maybe charge a little less because they're paying out less because they happen to, by chance or for whatever reason, have a bunch of healthy people have migrated to that insurance company. So this risk adjustment program will, if you have an insurance company that has a healthy population, this tax will be taxed against those insurance companies, and that money will be taken and given to the insurance companies that have a less healthy population to further socialize the costs so that, again, everybody is paying for everybody else's high medical costs. I think the picture there, the cartoon, is a pretty good illustration of what we're faced with. So I want to just talk quickly about the more important taxes that I just mentioned, and one of those, the most important one, is the individual mandate tax. And this tax is going to be imposed on you this year, 2014, unless you have health insurance during the year in one of 4 different ways, and you must have it before April 1st, 2014. March 31st is the open enrollment deadline to enroll in Obamacare, and there is also a provision in the law that says if you do not have Obamacare qualified insurance in any 3 months of the year, you're going to be subject to the penalty. So that March 31st date is important for 2 different reasons. It's the deadline for enrolling in Obamacare, and it also signals the end of 3 months that if you haven't had Obamacare qualified insurance, you will be subject to the penalty. The 4 options for you are to get your insurance either as an individual, private insurance through the health exchange or on your own, or through an employer-sponsored plan, through Medicaid, through Medicare, or a military plan. You've got VA or one of those options. So again, the reasons for this penalty is that, as I stated earlier, Obamacare has kind of destroyed the economic viability of health insurance by changing the very definition of insurance. And so nobody but the chronically sick would buy it voluntarily. Hence, you have a forced purchase mandate. That's also the reason for the employer mandate, because again, it's no longer now makes financial economic sense. Employers, especially when they got to cover hundreds and hundreds of employees, obviously would jump ship if it were not for the fact that they will now be faced with a pretty significant mandate. This mandate applies to large employers, and the way they define large employers is you have at least 50 full-time employees. Full-time means 30 hours or more per week, and you have to provide them with affordable health insurance. Again, it has to be insurance that has all the mandates in it, and it has to cost the employee less than, the employee's share must be less than 9.5% of their adjusted gross income. So let's just round that off roughly to 10%. That's only the cost for the employee himself, and you only have to offer it to the employee himself. If, for instance, the employee has a spouse and kids, you can charge more than that for them. And if you do the math, I mean, who knows how employers will set this up, because again, they only have to provide it to the employee. But for example, if they charge roughly 9.5% per family member, you could see roughly almost 40% for a family of 4, roughly almost 40% of your income going to health insurance, and yet that's considered apparently affordable care under the Affordable Care Act. If you do not, oh, and by the way, that mandate on employers originally was supposed to go into effect January 1st, the same date as for individuals and the individual mandate. Well, you know, some in the administration started seeing, wow, this is going to have a huge impact on our economy, and we got to let big business get adjusted to this new approach and new costs, and so they deferred it for a year. President Obama gave them a 1-year delay, and then recently, for businesses between 50 and 100 employees gave him a 2-year delay until January 1st, 2016. And while on the one hand, people might say, well, at least he's trying to respond to the economy, the truth of the matter is that puts individuals in even a worse box, because a lot of them may have been going to rely on their employer to provide Obamacare qualified insurance, and now their employer doesn't have to comply with the law for at least 1, maybe 2 years. And in the meantime, they've got to either come up with the money and the wherewithal to get Obamacare insurance, or they have to pay the penalty or perhaps qualify for an exemption, which I will get into in a minute. So again, that delay on business isn't necessarily a help. But let me explain to you why they've made the delay. There are a number of pieces of economic data and economic research that says that this mandate on employers is going to have a significant impact on the U.S. economy. The Federal Reserve has something called the Beige Book, and their recent Beige Book on the country's economic outlook reported that employers in 7 of its 12 districts are hesitant to hire or are cutting back hours and employees because of Obamacare. And by the way, you may notice that one of the features in this is based on whether they have 50 or more full-time employees, and they define full-time as 30 hours or more. So some businesses are actually not expanding to more than 50 employees if they were slightly under. Other businesses are actually trying to get back under 50 employees and full-time employees, and one of the ways some businesses are doing it is to get rid of their full-time employees, or at least some of them, and move towards part-time employees who are working less than 30 hours. In fact, there was a recent public opinion strategies poll that found that 64% of small business owners believe that Obamacare will have a negative economic impact, and 27% of franchise businesses are already replacing full-time employees with part-time help. And that's pretty striking, because that says more than 1/4 of them are already moving to part-time employees when the mandate doesn't even take effect for them until at least a year or perhaps even 2 years down the road. And so there is reason to be concerned, and there is a reason why the administration has backed off a little bit. Now again, you may recall that one of the promises under Obamacare from President Obama and from the Democrats in Congress who passed it was that it would create jobs, that it would actually create jobs. According to the Congressional Budget Office, and again, that's a nonpartisan arbiter, implementation of Obamacare will result in the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs lost by 2024, in other words, in the next decade. And that's equivalent to a reduction in the labor force of 2%, which equates to $325 billion per year in lost productivity to the U.S. economy. So again, the only way to make a mandate work, I mean, you can go out and tell people, you've got to buy this insurance, but the only way you can make it work is to have penalties attached. So that's the next logical step. And again, you're going to see that there's a logical connection. One domino leads to another to another. So the penalties under the Obamacare mandate for individuals are again phased in. They start out this year, 2014, at a $95 minimum, and then if 1% of your family income is greater than $95, it's based on 1% of your family income. And that was supposed to be capped in 2014 at a $285 maximum. In 2015, next year, it was going to go to 2% of your family income with a $975 cap. And in 2016, a 2.5% of your income and a $2,085 cap. But you will notice on my slide that there are a bunch of big red question marks. And the reason for that is less than a week ago, the IRS came out with a new advisory interpretation of how those penalties will be calculated. And that up in the upper right corner is the IRS publication that I received less than a week ago. And the language you see there on that slide comes directly from that IRS interpretation. And you will note the wording in red in particular. It says the annual amount for 2014 is the greater of, and then it goes down to 2 bullet points. And it was always the greater of those 2 bullet points, but the interesting fact is where they placed the maximum limit of $285. And you see it there that it is placed in the second bullet point rather than before both bullet points or after both bullet points. And the interpretation of that, coming from, again, a tax accountant who's been doing this for almost 40 years, is that that means the $285 maximum only applies to the second bullet point. As a result, if you work through all the math, it is likely that this means that your limit for 2014 is not going to be $285. It's going to be 1% of your adjusted gross, or not adjusted gross income, your income. And in 2015, 2% of your income, and in 2016, 2.5% of your income. And that the only limit, upper limit on that penalty is down in that last sentence where it says, this is capped at the cost of the national average premium for the bronze level health plan in 2014. And again, that's several thousands and thousands of dollars. The average government subsidy is going to be more than $5,290, so you can guess that the full cost of insurance is probably in the tens of thousands. And so there really is not much of a cap at all. It's probably going to be 1% of your income this year, and 2% next year, and 2.5% the year after. Okay, so quickly I'm moving back to the previous slide, and I want to talk about the employer mandate. The employer mandate is 2 parts. One says that you'll be charged $2,000, and I don't know if we have any people who work for large employers in here, or if you potentially are a large employer, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to try to explain how it works, because it's a little bit counterintuitive. It says that they can be charged a $2,000 per employee penalty if they don't provide health insurance after 2015, or a $3,000 penalty for each employee who, even if they provide insurance, if it's not, quote, affordable insurance, health insurance, they can be subject to a $3,000 penalty for each employee that goes to the government website, the insurance exchange, and buys insurance through the government website. It's a little bit counterintuitive. The $2,000 penalty is called the strong penalty, and the $3,000 penalty is called the weak penalty. And the reason is because the $2,000 penalty is assessed based on every one of your full-time employees, whereas the $3,000 penalty is only assessed based on your employees who go out and buy insurance through the insurance exchange. So the way that businesses are trying to mitigate this potentially millions of dollar cost, there are 2 different ways they're doing it. One of them is they're setting up a very minimal plan that charges the employee the very maximum they can possibly charge them, the 9.5% of their income, either doesn't cover their family members, or if it does, charges them another 9.5% for each. On top of that, they're basically setting up a plan that ostensibly complies with the law, but it costs the employees so much to participate that they're hopeful that a lot of their employees won't participate. Okay, so that's one approach. The other approach that's a little more employee-friendly is they're setting up something called a skinny plan. And what a skinny plan is basically a plan with a very high deductible. It only covers very limited types of medical conditions. And so it's a plan that it's not qualified Obamacare insurance, because again, in order to qualify as Obamacare insurance, it has to have all the socialization mandates in it. So it's called a skinny plan, a very limited plan with a high deductible that doesn't cost their employees very much to participate in. They only charge them a small participation fee, and that exempts the employer from the $2,000 per employee strong penalty, but they're still subject to the $3,000 penalty for each employee who goes to the health exchange. But the theory is, well, most of my employees are just going to want the skinny plan and just have a small contribution. And so only a few of them, probably those who end up with a severe medical condition, only a few of them are going to go out and after they have a severe medical situation, sign up for Obamacare insurance because, again, you can't exclude people with pre-existing conditions, and so they'll only have to pay the $3,000 penalty on a few of their employees. That's how a lot of the businesses are now going to be dealing with this, is set up something called a skinny plan. Now, I got to tell you that the one bit of confusion that I don't think a lot of people are clear on with respect to either the individual mandate or the employer mandate, there's a lot of speculation that, well, since you can't exclude people with pre-existing conditions, why don't, I'm just going to not have insurance now, at least not Obamacare qualified insurance. I might go out and buy myself a high deductible plan or something that doesn't qualify as Obamacare, and I'm going to just pay the penalty, and then if I really get sick, I'll just sign up for Obamacare insurance then. Well, there's only one problem with that, and that problem is that the open enrollment period, again, ends on March 31st. That means if you haven't signed up for Obamacare insurance through the health exchanges by then, you can't sign up after that until the next open enrollment period, which will probably be late in the year in November and December. They haven't even said when it'll be, but it'll probably be late in the year, and you'll be able to sign up for the next year going forward. So if you didn't have any insurance, if you just said, I'm just going to self-insure or take the risk and sign up once I get sick, and then you got really sick, let's say in June, you could be in a situation where you could have some high medical costs prior to when you could finally sign up for Obamacare insurance. So we could end up with a situation where more people are actually uninsured than we had, especially with a lot of insurance policies being canceled because of Obamacare. We could end up with more people uninsured than we had prior to this time, even though the goal was allegedly to get everybody insured. It's an amazing transition that is going on. So, I'll let you ask a quick one now. We're going to take question and answer at the end, by the way, but go ahead if you got something that you need to have answered or you don't understand the rest. Go for it.
This, it obviously doesn't make sense. There's just so many penalties, there's so many negatives to this. Why are they going ahead with it?
We're going to talk about some of that at the end, but let me paint the whole picture first. So the next logical question that probably arises once people start realizing, wow, I could be faced with this year several hundreds of dollars of penalty, and next year thousands or more of penalty. Is there any alternative? And there are at least 21 different exemptions under Obamacare. And I'm going to quickly go through some of them. The first 8 are called status exemptions. The last 13 are called hardship exemptions. The last 13 are based on some hardship in your life, whereas the first 8 are just based on your status. The first of those is if you are uninsured for less than 3 months. Again, I mentioned that as long as you get insurance under Obamacare within less than 3 months of the beginning of the year, you won't be subject to the penalty. The second is if the lowest priced coverage available to you costs more than 8% of your family income. And again, that's how they define, they call it the Affordable Care Act, and they define Affordable Care as 8% of your income if you acquire your insurance directly through the exchange, or 9.5% of your income if you acquire it through your employer, and again, 9.5% per family member. I had a reporter ask me today, well, Montana's such low income, don't you think a lot of people are going to be jumping at the chance to get this affordable insurance? And I said, ma'am, I've been an accountant in Montana, and I've lived in Montana my entire life, and an accountant for 4 decades. And I can tell you that for a lot of low-income people in Montana, they don't have 8% of their income that they can afford to kick in, even if the taxpayers subsidize all the rest. They don't have 8% of their income. And a lot of them don't even believe in or participate in the general medical treatment regime. They're into alternative medicine. And they simply would like to keep their money, their 8% that they don't even have, and use it for other needs in their low-income families. And so that's part of the problem, is what they define in Washington, D.C. as affordable care isn't necessarily affordable for many Montanans, okay? So that's the second exemption. The third is you don't have to, your income is so low you don't even have to file a return. The fourth is you're a member of a federally recognized tribe. You're a Native American. The fifth, oh, by the way, I had a Jewish friend of mine who they have checks sent to them to cover their need. That's called healthcare sharing ministry. The Obama administration and the Democrats in Congress put that into the plan that would be a qualified exemption. So interestingly enough, in Montana, when I was in the Montana State Senate, we tried twice to get a law passed in Montana that would recognize these healthcare sharing ministries as inadequate and could amount to millions and millions of dollars. There's a further benefit with the skinny plan that I forgot to mention, and that benefit is if your employer offers you a skinny plan, that exempts you, the employee, from the individual mandate penalty as well. And so it's actually a far more employee-friendly option for employers than the other option I told you about, which was to offer an Obamacare qualified plan that is going to cost your employees so much money that a lot of them aren't even going to sign up. So that's why a lot of employers are looking seriously at the plan. The one question is that it appears like if you have less than 50 employees, you're not going to qualify for doing that skinny plan approach. And I think there's some legislation out there to try to say, look, if bigger business can qualify it, let's let smaller businesses use that approach as well. It's a good question. Someone else, yes, sir.
In 2012, Montana voters passed a ballot initiative to nullify the individual mandate, and I was just wondering what happened to that and how we're not exempt since that passed.
Well, there's potentially two more ballot initiatives that are going to be on the ballot in 2014. As for the one that was passed in 2012, it was a referendum that came from the legislature, and I believe that passed when I was still there, and I voted for it. It was passed, but again, you constantly have the clash of federal government versus state government and who is preeminent, and so especially if you have executives that are supportive of Obamacare, which we currently have in Montana, with the exception of Attorney General Tim Fox, it's going to be difficult to even see that clash go to the courts because the executive branch, the governor, they don't want to enforce that voter-passed referendum. They want to see Obamacare move forward. There are two more initiatives that have been put before the Attorney General and are probably headed for the ballot if they get enough signatures. These are not referenda, so they need to get enough voters to sign up to put them on the ballot. One of them is Medicaid expansion. Even though we defeated it at the legislature, and the legislature they said this just isn't right for the people of Montana. The left in Montana is putting that initiative, they're trying to get enough signatures to put that initiative on the ballot to expand Medicaid in the fall. There's another contrary initiative by a gentleman in Bozeman, Matthew Monfort, an attorney, that would basically prohibit the state from appropriating any money to enforce any part of Obamacare, presumably including Medicaid expansion. And of course, if both those initiatives pass, which might be the case, we'll have to see some sort of litigation. Unfortunately, Montana has the most left-wing court system in the country, and so it's unlikely to be a fair playing field and fair court hearing on if both initiatives passed. And next year, that whole period will start over again as to whether you had it for 9 months or not. And even if you get an exemption this year, next year you will have to reapply for an exemption.